Okay.
Yep. Good.
Yep. Hello. Yeah, we'll discuss zero knowledge proofs today. Like in, it's okay if you don't know what any of those terms mean. Like we'll start off with some basics of complexity theory just to brush up, or like for people who are new, like yeah, you can just think of this as your introduction to complexity. So the formalism in complexity theory is you have something called languages. Uh, a language L is just a collection of strings X, where like X is some like binary string of any length. Star here means like you're allowing like all lengths, okay? And you have, so you can think of almost any computational problem as a language. For example, like let's say you want to solve the sorting problem. Okay, solving the sorting problem is difficult, but let's think of some decision problem. Okay, like if you want to check if a sequence is sorted, right? So all you can do is you can construct a language where the string is going to be concatenation of all the numbers in your array with some like terminating like sequence that splits them, right? And you encode everything in binary. And the question is like, given a string of this form, does it belong to the language L sorted? Right? So L sorted will be the language set of all strings such that when you actually break it down into an array of numbers, you end up getting a sorted sequence. So for example, yeah, like once you design something like this and you have like say 5 here and 4 here, then yeah, this will not belong to the set of strings L sorted. Okay. And this is basically like how I formalize like all computation and complexity theory and computability theory. So the next thing is like you have so many languages, right? Like each language corresponds to some like problem that you're trying to solve. And obviously there are like similarities that you see when you solve problems. Like you can probably use the same algorithm to solve multiple problems. So like you know that two problems are like equally difficult in some sense, or uh, like one problem is like really much harder than something else, and you want to like capture all this notion in terms of these sets and the relation between them. So we have something known as classes. So a class is just a collection of languages L, okay, satisfying some constraint. Okay, you're free to define your own classes. Like there's nothing really stopping you from defining a class, just like there's nothing really stopping you from defining a language. Like you can pick your favorite strings and call it like L my favorite strings. Similarly, you can pick your favorite languages, like the problems you're interested in, and call them like yeah, class of my favorite languages. And but the thing is, like there are a lot of like very nice sets of languages which have like interesting like common properties that we exploit. So the first, like probably the most popular, one of the most popular classes is something called P, which is the set of languages such that uh, I'm going to hand wave a lot of definitions here. I will try to get more formal as I go on, but like for for sake of intuition, like they're roughly equivalent. Like if you really want more formal definitions, like we can discuss at after the session is over, or like over chat later on. So L can be solved in polynomial time. Okay, that is, you can give me a computer and a polynomial time algorithm implemented on that computer such that it will take a string X and it will tell you whether it's in that language L or not. Okay, so here like yeah, we're only worried about like saying yes or no. You want to just talk about like whether they belong, like whether the strings like inputs belong to the language or not. We're not worried about more complex algorithms where like you take some input, process it, and return something else as output. Okay, so like these are like a special class of problems called decision problems. Like you want to just decide. Okay, whether a particular string is in a language or not. And P is the class of all languages such that there is a polynomial time like algorithm or like a computer that runs in polynomial time for every input you give it, such that it can tell you whether the string in that language, like whether an input string belongs to that language or not. So for example, a simple language inside P could be is the string made up of all zeros, right? So L could be the language such that it's 0 power k for all k, right? Like when I say power k, it's like you just repeat the string, like repeat that character k times. It's like 0, 0, 0 k times. And this is in P, right? Because all you need to do is like you iterate through the string and you check whether it's like all zeros or not. Like the moment you hit a 1, you just stop and say it's not, or otherwise you say it is. So here when I say polynomial time, I mean polynomial time in the length of the input. Okay, that's crucial, and like obviously we need to have like, definitions in terms of something, and it's always defined in terms of the length of the input string. Okay, so you give it a shorter string, it should be a polynomial in that length. If it's longer, it should be a polynomial. I mean, whatever the length is, right? So in this case, it's actually linear. Like you know that you have a linear time algorithm that solves this. And yeah, in general, like you can have much larger classes. For example, something like the sorting thing, right? Like all you need to do is check adjacent elements. That's also linear. Can somebody give me some example of like something not linear, something really slow but still polynomial? I'm quite blank at this moment. Wait, can I hear? Can somebody speak? I'm not sure if I can hear or not. Just
Hello.
yeah, okay, it works. Yeah, I can hear. So okay, nobody is talking.
Like
I
number
don't.
of configurations you can put like different color balls in.
Uh,
I guess
like
it's not
can you?
exponential. Like
No,
if
what
you have
is?
3 balls, so
No,
like
but okay.
how
So the
many
thing is,
configurations are there?
yeah. So
Like
that
calculate
is like
factorials basically.
right. So the problem there is, uh, it's not a decision problem, right? Like you're given some natural number input and you want to give a natural number output, and it is a valid computational problem. But we'll be sticking to this set where we'll only talk about decision problems, which is like given a string or an input, it has to tell yes or no whether it belongs to the language or not. So usually there's one way to convert. Okay, I'm just going to use the entire page. Okay, I just realized this is bad. This is a bad idea. Yeah. So there's one way to convert general function problems into the decision problems. Like they don't obviously like mean the exact same thing, but like roughly you can capture the idea. So let's say you have like in your case you want to compute that number of permutations, right? So let's say it's some f uh, yeah fc or something, which takes a number n and then returns the number of like uh, ways of arranging, or like let's say it computes n factorial or something. So we can model this as a language such that it contains all strings n concatenated with n factorial, right? With probably some like protocol to disambiguate by adding a terminator, uh, like adding a separator between the two, right? So now the question is like the decision problem for this will be give me n and give me the result, and I will tell you if like the function actually returns that result. Okay, so this is one way of decisionifying a more general problem. And the issue with this is like, I mean, it's polynomial. Like checking this is definitely polynomial time because you can like it's linear time, in fact, because you can compute n factorial in n factorial time, right? And then you have to just match it with this. Okay, it's not linear. I mean, you can like come up with like hacks to make sure it becomes linear, because the time is computed in terms of the length of the entire string, and the length of this entire string is going to be like yeah, uh, the length of n plus the length of n factorial, right?
Yeah.
Actually, this is not polynomial time. This is going to be exponential, no?
Well, length will grow exponentially.
No, the
N
length of n
factorial.
factorial is log n factorial,
So
because like
it's
the
log
number
n
of bits
factorial.
needed. Yeah, so the length is just n log n,
Yeah.
but to compute it, you need to actually like divide or multiply or something, which,
Computing n factorial or computing
yeah,
n
computing n
factorial?
factorial, yeah. I'm quite confused at this moment. Yeah.
I mean, you have to multiply n times like numbers of at most n log n bits. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's just n square log n, which is quadratic in the input size, right?
Oh, yeah. Okay, fine. Right. Yeah. So yeah, this is like polynomial then. Let's hope uh, I don't get confused as much later on. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, like you can come up with like different like classes of decision like different languages that are can be solved in polynomial time. The next like important like okay, so why are we so interested in polynomial time? Because like there's just this like common notion that uh, polynomial time is efficient. Okay, like if you can solve anything in polynomial time, we consider it to be like some sort of efficient computation because it doesn't grow as much, but like it still gives you enough power like to compute. And usually when you solve like practical problems, like most of the times you try to come up with like polynomial time algorithms. Sometimes like yeah, you might pick slightly slower ones asymptotically, but like if you have very small inputs, you don't really care about complexity that much, right? So yeah, that's why P is like an important class. The next thing would be uh, something called NP, okay, which is non-deterministic polynomial time. Contrary to the two initials they use, like uh, it doesn't stand for non-polynomial time, which I mean would be like a very difficult class to like even understand. Okay. So can somebody like, I mean, who's new to complexity theory or has heard like very little, give me a definition of this? Like I'm expecting a wrong definition. So yeah, like if you studied it already, like please don't answer. Like what do you think NP is? Like or when you first heard of like P and P versus NP, the famous like millennium problem, what did you think NP was? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So yeah, NP like people usually think it's non-polynomial time. That is like people say, okay, it takes exponential amount of time to solve it, or even more than that. But that's actually not true. It just stands for like using a slightly different impractical computer to solve a problem in polynomial time. Okay, so use like instead of using a normal computer and like all these computers that you have in like reality, they're uh, considered to be equivalent in computational power to something called a Turing machine. Okay, so Turing machine is an abstract formalization of all possible efficient computers that can potentially exist, like be built by humans. Okay, so it's like one single abstraction of that, and usually like if you can solve something efficiently on a real world computer, you should be able to solve something like on a Turing machine and vice versa, and that is actually called the like that the statement that I just said is actually called the Church-Turing hypothesis. Why is it a hypothesis? That's not proved yet. Like we believe that like everything can be simulated like with a Turing machine, but yeah, like there could be like potential groundbreaking models of computation that could break this assumption. But for our purposes now, we'll just take that as a given in our like study. Okay, so you can solve anything using a Turing machine. Okay, And this uses something called a non-deterministic Turing machine. And what it does is, instead of like, like running, like the machine is just like a simplified, like normal desktop computer or something, which which will just like keep running instructions, reading the input, like maintaining some internal state and an extra stack, like the usual way we have like our computation. Okay, you have code, you have like memory on a stack which maintains all that information, right? The non-deterministic Turing machine, it, instead of running this computer once, it basically creates like infinite parallel worlds and freely explores all of them. Okay, it's not parallel computing in the sense like of like practical parallel computing where you still have like finite cores and you still need to worry about like how to split the task. Yeah, it's like theoretically parallel, like you have infinitely different paths of computation, and in each thing you're free to explore like whatever choices you want. So for example, like if you want to check like something where like at some stage of computation you want to like make a choice, you want to like go into like two different paths, like if else, you can actually explore both of them simultaneously. And if each path finishes its computation in finite time, in polynomial time, and then you take all the results and you say that, okay, like if any of the paths says yes, then the answer is yes, and if all of the paths say no, then the answer is no. Then this becomes like a language in the class NP. So if you can construct an NDTM such that it does that, like it's slightly more powerful than a normal Turing machine, which only can like keep running one like path of computation. So a nice example for this is, let's say you want to solve 3SAT. Okay, so you have some Boolean formula like this, and like something. You have a long Boolean formula of like length n with like n variables and m clauses, right? And if you want to solve this using a normal Turing machine or like a normal computer, like we don't yet know any algorithm that can do this efficiently in polynomial time. Like we have like exponential and slightly, I think, quasi-polynomial algorithms, but like there is no polynomial algorithm to like solve this that has been discovered yet. But if you have non-determinism, you can do this, right? Like you can have two parts of computation. Like you just make the choice, like either x1 is 0 in one of the parallel universes and x1 is 1 in the other parallel universe. So you just create like two power each thing with one possible assignment, and then to substitute them and check, you just take like order m time, right? Where m is the number of terms, and then by definition of 3SAT, like if any of these assignments is satisfiable, like it says yes, then yeah, like this expression is like 3SAT. Otherwise, it's not. So this gives you like a possibly stronger like way of solving problems, right? So you have like, and of course, like here the input length is going to be like n plus m. Okay, so input length is n plus m. So this is going to be polynomial time and like input length. It just like does a lot of like so-called non-deterministic computation. Okay, so I mean the easiest way to intuit non-determinism is, yeah, think of like many universes existing, and like basically everything that says no, that just gets destroyed, and if some universe exists at the end, yeah, like it's yes, otherwise yeah, it's no. Okay, so this is the class NP. I am also checking the chat, so if you don't want to speak up, you can also type in the chat. Okay, so the next let me formalize this a little bit. Okay, so like to say a language is an NP, I say that there exists, so there's another like definition, like equivalent definition for NP, that is like it can be verified in polynomial time. Okay, that means like in 3SAT, like instead of me trying to solve the problem and just look at the input and tell, you give me the problem input along with something called like I forgot what it's called. Yeah, it's called a proof. It's called a proof because like it actually finally helps you prove that the input is in the language or not, right? So you give me two things now. an input and a proof, and like of length n, and the proof is like the proof shouldn't be so too long. Oh, certificate, thank you. Certificate, yeah, that's the actual term. Thank you. So the certificate has to be like in some polynomial length of n. Like you don't want to give me like a huge certificate like for a very small input, and like I can't sit and like it'll take me so much time to just read the certificate. So that's not like really efficiently verifying. Okay. So like the proof has like certificate has to be some polynomial length string that certifies whether the input belongs to the language or not. Okay. So formally speaking, like for all like inputs x and l, like there has to exist some certificate c, okay, which is polynomial length in l, such that like okay, so the verifier, let's say the verifier is like a machine b, okay, who takes two things x and c and then spits out like yes or no, right? So there exists c such that the verifier of x comma c gives you 1, and like for all strings that are not in the language, and so the thing is like if the string is in the language, there has to be one certificate to certify it's in the language. But if it's not, then no matter what certificate I give you, you should not get cheated by that certificate, right? So for all certificates, like has to be 0. Okay. So if you can come up with v here, what is v here? V is some polynomial time Turing machine. It's just a normal Turing machine, no non-determinism, no extra power. But where did we throw away that non-determinism? Like with the certificate. So notice that the equivalence like intuitively comes because instead of like non-deterministically making all these choices, let's say there's some like higher power that knows this future, they can tell you that exact set of choices and like serialize it in a string called a certificate and give it to you. So instead of you having to explore everything, it'll just tell you like, okay, I don't need to actually explore everything. Like somebody else has like told me that this is the right path, so I'll just follow it. And also notice that like if there is no path, then no matter what path you tell me to take, I'm always going to reach a no. Right? Hope that makes sense. Okay, so I think I spent enough time in basic definition. So this is like what the basic complexity classes P, P and P are. And then like one more class that I'm just going to throw, like there's something called P space, which is like problems that can be solved in polynomial space. So you don't have a like constraint on time. You can take potentially infinite time, but you have to only use polynomial amount of space on the Turing machine. Okay, you can only have that much memory, and you can show that like yeah, this like you cannot use more than exponential time because you will have explored all possible like configurations of your space. Because if you have polynomial amount of space, then you can put only 2 power that polynomial like amount of strings in that space. So after exponential time, you would have like run out of like options, and you'll like keep looping back. Okay, so this is polynomial space, and there's something called exp time, and like this is a subset of this. Okay, so yeah, and these are the basic classes that we will be keeping in mind. Okay, so now enough of like complexity theory. Let's play some games, and then yeah, hopefully get back to more complexity theory. Okay, so the first like important thing to know is like we want to study zero knowledge proofs, right? What just happened? Okay, seems to have recovered, thankfully. Okay, it's happening. So we want to know what zero knowledge is, but before that, we want to know what a proof is, and then what a proof system is. Okay, so first, like forget. Right, forget like zero knowledge for the moment. Like we will discuss what knowledge is in complexity theory, which is like already a hugely debated problem in philosophy. We'll just talk about proofs. So let's say there are like, so back in the NP case, what did we see? There's a verifier, and the verifier gets a certificate, right? So now we'll just humanize the source of the certificate, like we'll humanize the verifier. So there's a verifier and there's a prover. So I should probably not use P for polynomial and prover. Fine, I don't know. If somebody comes up with better notation, please tell me. Okay, so there's a prover, and the prover gives C to the verifier, and and assume the prover is like has all information. So there's an input string X, and the prover gives this extra thing C after looking at X, right? And the verifier says yes or no, right? So this is our construction for NP. And notice that there's no need for us to just the prover to just tell the verifier the string C, right? We can do something more complicated. Can the verifier utilize the prover even more? Okay, so right now whatever is happening in this seminar is NP, because I am like the prover and the teacher, and you're the verifiers, and because nobody is talking to me except Abhinav, who corrected one of my mistakes. Yeah, I'm just giving you all this information and you're taking it, and hopefully you'll be able to answer, understand this concept and resolve whatever. And now I'm going to introduce I'm going to make it more complicated, and hopefully the seminar will also catch up with the trend, and I can hear more voices. There's an input string X, there's a verifier, and there's a prover, right? But now the verifier realizes, okay, the prover is really powerful. Okay, so here the verifier is going to be running like a polynomial time machine, but the prover is all powerful. Okay, the prover can do anything, right? And if you really trusted the prover, then yeah, there's no problem. You don't even need to ask for a certificate. You can just ask for yes or no, tell me the answer and I will tell it to other people. But obviously you won't just go ahead and trust an all-knowing prover, right? You still want to make sure that you are using that computational power of the prover, but still not getting cheated into being given a wrong answer, right? Which I could potentially do here. I could teach you a wrong concept and you can just take it back. But obviously you want to make sure that you're learning the right thing, even though you might not have all that knowledge or know all that theory. Or yeah, I mean, to draw the exact analogy, you might not be as powerful as me, right? You still want to be able to understand it. Okay, I'm not trying to be condescending. It's just the analogy here. Okay, no, please don't take it the wrong way. Right, so the verifier realizes, okay, I can get some more out of the prover. So what I'll do is the prover sends in a certificate or something. The verifier will now go ahead and ask the prover a question. Okay, and then the prover has to respond back to that question. So the verifier looks at the certificate. It also knows the input, obviously. Okay, the prover implicitly knows the input because yeah, it knows everything. The input is public information. The verifier looks at the certificate and decides, okay, it's hard for me to just solve the problem with this. I'm trying to solve a much harder problem than the NP problems that you looked at. So okay, I'll go ahead and ask the prover some other question, and the prover will respond. Okay, and then I'll go again ask one more question, and the prover will again respond, and so on, until the verifier now has enough answers from the prover for the exact queries that it has asked to make sure that it can finally say yes or no. And now you can obviously see that this interaction is definitely not less powerful than before, right? Because if it wanted to just do NP, then it can just ignore all the answers to the questions, even if you ask the questions, and freely answer based on its previous computational, previously based computational algorithm. But now it has more information, and it can smartly craft these questions to the prover, and the prover is supposed to respond. And then the verifier can try to make sure that with this extra information, with this questions, it can try to hopefully solve more problems than before, right? So interaction cannot be worse. It's only going to make it better. The obvious question is whether it's absolutely better, and that's still open. Nobody still knows that, but we can always come up with more practical protocols, or under certain constraints, or under certain assumptions that okay, this actually gives us slightly more power than we think we can, right? So I will now I know this is still not a formal definition, and I'm not going to bore you too much with that, but let's think of a simple interactive proof. Okay, so we'll pick this famous problem. Okay, so I hope folks here know what graphs are. I mean, not the XY coordinate line graphs, like the ones with nodes and edges connecting them, right? So 1 second. Yeah. So there's this famous problem called graph isomorphism, which is like you're given two graphs, say A, B, C, and something like this, 1, 2, 3, 4. Like obviously two people have two different graphs, like they're labeled differently, they're stored differently, and you want to tell if they're isomorphic. That is, they're actually same in structure. Like, can you relabel one graph to the other so that you get the exact same thing again? So in this case, these two are isomorphic. And can somebody see why this is not a trivial problem? Like, you can't just look at the graph and just say yes or no, right? Like, you need to do a little more. You can't just it's not super easy to solve it, but there's a nice easy way to solve it. Like, all you need to do is you need that function f that maps the labels. So here it takes A to 3 or something, B to 4, and C to so it takes A to 3, it takes B to 4, it takes C to 2, and it takes D to 1, right? So as long as somebody gives you that function and it's inverse, it's inverse, then you, or one of them, right? Because you can compute the inverse from the function itself, make sure that it's bijective, right? Then you can solve this. So this effectively becomes NP, right? Because all you need to do is there's the verifier, there's the prover, and the prover gives this function f as the certificate. How does he give the function f? Just assume some canonical form for the first input, and for that, for each vertex, just list out the corresponding permutation or something. Okay, just don't use very random labels. Everything is labeled 1 to n, 1 to n. So just give a permutation that remaps these labels. So you give this polynomial length sequence, right? That tells you how to do it, and the verifier just takes this input x, applies f on that graph that corresponds to the serialized x, and then tells you whether it's isomorphic or not, right? So this is fairly simple. We solved it with a very small class. But then there's this other problem of there's other problem of graph non-isomorphism. Okay, and now I think because nobody's asking questions, I'll just ask the questions that I had when I learned complexity theory. I was why is this difficult from graph isomorphism? If you can tell if it's isomorphic or not. Wait, now I'm confused. Yeah, if you can tell if it's isomorphic or not, then why can't you tell if it's non-isomorphic? You can just say, take the isomorphism output and then just flip it, right? Say no, yes. Correct? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So why is this problem different from graph isomorphism? People say that this is actually slightly harder in terms of solving, and they're not actually the same problem. Why? Where does that come from?
Because in isomorphism, if you give one certificate, then you have the solution, and for non-isomorphism you have to you have to prove that there is no such certificate.
Right, but what is the problem with this protocol? Like I can just flip the output, right? What is the mistake in flipping the output in this protocol here on the left side? Like what you said comes on the,
Just giving one
Yeah.
wrong example does not mean there does not exist a correct function.
yeah, exactly. So when we go back to the definition, we realize here that for saying yes, it has to give at least exist one, and for no, it has to be for all. So if you flip the output, you'll actually get a very different definition, which is no longer the same NP we define. You will say like for all things it will say yes, and there exists something where it will say no, and that no longer is NP anymore. Okay, so it has to fit this exact definition. So there is this asymmetry here between what gives you 0 and what gives you 1. So unlike in P where like you always decide yes or no, so you can just flip the output, here it's not that trivial. Okay, we have this extra condition which is asymmetric, and when you swap, you get something different. And in fact, the class that you get when you swap this is something called co-NP. Like a co-class is basically anything that gives you the opposite output. And in the P case, we know that P is equal to co-P because flipping the output is just like, yeah, run the algorithm, flip the answer. So there's no difference in telling yes, no versus no, yes, right? For example, if you have a problem like, is this sorted versus is this not sorted? They're the same thing. Like, I mean, they're like not the same thing, but like they're equally like solvable using the same algorithm, just flip or not. But yeah, the moment you add some non-triviality and like asymmetry to your like complexity classes, you can no longer do this trivially. So whenever something like this happens, it's always best to go back to the definition, flip, see the definition again, see if you can actually like see if you get back the exact same class. And in this case, we don't, right? So to prove it's isomorphic, all I need to do is give one isomorphism. But to prove it's non-isomorphic, I have to show that for every function that exists in this universe, every permutation, I have to show it's not. And naturally, you can see the difficulty here. There are n factorial permutations. And if I have to keep giving every permutation, like you don't even need to give, right? Like the other person can go and like the verifier can like itself sit and run all permutations. But we get the advantage in the no case. Like to prove it's like if it is indeed if it is indeed isomorphic, then the prover can just give that one function and the verifier will know, okay, like this is isomorphic, so the answer has to be no for the non-isomorphism problem. Like I see there's a lot of interaction, too many no's, but yeah, like you can just flip. Okay. So that's why like graph isomorphism and graph non-isomorphism, even though they seem very similar, like they're actually not the same. So now how do we come up with this? So what we do is like we have the input x, which can be decoded into a pair of graphs, right? Which is the same in the previous case. Like the input can be decoded into a pair of graphs, somehow like nicely serialized, polynomial time. The verifier sees this pair. Now the prover also like has access to this pair. So how does a verifier now make sure that it can do this? So what the verifier will do is it will take the two graphs G and G dash, right? And it will randomly pick one of these two. Like so, let's name them G1, G2. So it'll randomly pick a graph GR where R is a like random bit. Okay, so it'll pick one of these two graphs randomly, and then relabel everything. That is, permute all the vertices, and then give this to the prover. So it will send this graph GR after permuting to the prover. And now the prover is supposed to tell whether it's 1 or 2. Okay, so he has to say yes if it is the first graph and no if it is the second graph. Okay, so now let's say the prover says yes. Okay, so that means it's G1. Okay, we just need like one bit, right? So yes, no, 0, 1, 1, 2, everything is the same. So now what the verifier does is it checks, okay, like did the prover actually tell the right graph? And it will keep doing this like a few more times. And then finally, when it's satisfied, it'll say yes or no. How does this help? Because let's say the two graphs are actually different. Then an all-knowing prover will always be able to tell you the correct graph it matches with, right? Because it can just see and say, okay, yeah, it's either G1 or G2. I can't get confused. But if G1 and G2 are same, then the prover, like, no matter what you do, the prover has no way to tell whether it's whether it's G1 or it's G2. G1 and G2 are the same, and the graph you got is also the same. So now the prover has to guess. So there's only 50% chance the prover makes the right guess. And if the verifier keeps repeating this enough number of times, the prover will eventually get caught. I hope that makes sense. So now, like, obviously,
can you repeat what you just said again? Sorry.
Okay. So the thing is, there are two cases, right? Either G1 is isomorphic to G2 or G1 is not isomorphic to G2. So in this case, let's consider the second case, okay, when it's not isomorphic. What will the prover do? It gets another graph GR, and because the prover is like all powerful, it can actually just match and see. So let's assume the prover can do any computational task instantly, okay? So all the prover has to do is check if G1 and GR are same or G2 and GR are same. And because G1 and G2 are different, GR will only match with one of them, right? And the prover will just tell that back. And every time the prover will get the answer right. But if you look at the first case, it will get GR, but now the prover just has 3 graphs that are all the same. And there is no way for the prover to know which one the verifier picked, right? The verifier could have picked G1 and given GR, or it could have picked G2 and given GR. And the prover cannot actually tell which one the verifier picked, and therefore has no choice but to make a guess. It has to just to not lose face, it just guesses yes, no, at random. And the best way to guess is 50-50, right? If you guess you can show that any probability, any strategy you use to guess will be worse or just equal to a random 50-50 strategy, right? So whatever strategy the prover uses to make this guess, the choice between G1 G2 randomly, and tell okay, this time I'll just pick this and that time I'll pick that, the verifier eventually let's say one round there's a 50% chance of the prover getting away, right? If you repeat it, there's a half chance of the prover getting away. If you keep repeating it, then the probability that the prover escapes every time, gets the right guess every time, is going to be power T, where T is the number of iterations, okay? And you can repeat this a large number of times, making this probability really small, okay? Not zero, okay? So, but you the verifier will be able to tell with extreme certainty that the prover is wrong. Not 100%, but almost extreme. Yeah. So in this process, we have actually implicitly upgraded the prover. The prover is no longer a polynomial time deterministic machine, right? Because the prover has to actually get random bits out, and there's no way for a deterministic machine to get randomness from anywhere. A Turing machine is purely deterministic. It can just run a given algorithm. So you can't make this random choice. So we are upgrading the prover to something called a BPP, okay? So this is a bounded polynomial time probabilistic machine, okay? So it's a probabilistic, sorry, not BPP, sorry.
One thing, can you just clarify what the goal of the verifier is? What is the verifier trying to achieve?
So the verifier has an input X, and it has to solve the problem of graph non-isomorphism. So it has to finally say yes or no. If yes, if the graphs are actually non-isomorphic, and no if the graphs are isomorphic.
And the prover on the other hand,
the prover is basically trying to help the verifier answer the question of graph non-isomorphism. So prover can do anything in constant time, and the prover is trying to help the verifier. The only reason the verifier can't blindly trust the prover is the prover can cheat, right? The prover can just give you the wrong answer. So obviously that's not a valid way to solve the problem. But given access to a prover and oracle that has infinite power, but you yourself have only finite power, can you still get an advantage is the question of interaction.
If the prover is malicious, can't the prover even if the prover knows what the graph is, can't it return a random?
Yeah, it can. So we'll come to that. We'll come to how the verifier will actually keep the prover in check. Make sure the prover doesn't say random shit.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, so first thing is we're upgrading the verifier to something called a probabilistic polynomial time Turing machine. Okay, the time is not in the abbreviation, PPTM, probabilistic polynomial time. P is for polynomial time. So what does it mean? It's a polynomial time machine with access to like coin flips. Okay, like if it wants, it can flip a coin and get a random bit of input, like random bit secret, like only inside the machine, like so that it can use that. So instead of, yeah, so usually we use randomized algorithms a lot, right? Like like when you want to solve a problem that's really hard to come up with a normal algorithm, you like try to generate, like you try to randomize, like try out different possibilities. There's huge research on this, like so many different algorithms and like applications in like various fields. So yeah, we're just upgrading the verifier, and we'll see that this upgrade from like just deterministic to non-deterministic gives us like so much more power than we like have been able to prove with deterministic. Okay, so now like, okay, let's go back to this. So the question Chanjit and Shashwat asked here, let's say the prover knows that the graphs are not isomorphic. Okay, but it wants to convince the verifier that the graphs are like indeed isomorphic. Okay, so what will the prover do? It'll always like, I mean, it knows the right answer, so it'll always make sure to flip it and give the wrong answer, and the verifier will keep seeing this, or like, yeah, the prover like lies like half the times and like tells the truth half the time. So verifier will look at it and be like, oh wait, okay, maybe these graphs are actually isomorphic. The prover is like getting confused, so for sure it's isomorphic, and then the prover breaks down. So now to be able to like overcome this, I forgot a part in the definition. Okay, so here we define this way, right? Like there exists certificate and for all certificates. So here also it's like for every input X, there exists a prover who can like if X is like, okay, let's write it down formally, like no harm. So if X is in the language, then okay, for all X in the language, there exists a prover P, okay, who can like on interaction, like interacting with like when V interacts with P and like takes the input X, it will finally say yes. And if X is not in the language, then for all provers P, then this same interaction we should give you no. If somebody knows why this is happening, please tell me. Journal ++ keeps crashing. Yeah, okay. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So there has to be a prover that can convince you that it's yes. And if it's no, then no matter which prover you take, good or bad, they can never convince you. So this is our definition, right? Like we just replace certificate with something slightly more powerful than a certificate, like a person who can tell you a little more than that. Okay, so there can be malicious provers, but we don't care. Like we just need one prover to exist so that we can do this. So obviously this does not directly translate into practice where you can just say, okay, like give me some all-knowing prover and I will be able to do everything for you. And because like it's hard to find an all-knowing prover in the first place, you can't just like build like an algorithm out of this. But we actually try to understand the class this way, and then we have equivalent definitions that can help us translate it into practice. Okay, so this is the class IP, or like in this case, like depending on how many rounds, IP K, where you have like K rounds, like round 1, round 2. You use like K rounds, like K question and answers. No, sorry. Yeah, I wrote down the deterministic version. Arjun corrects me. So it has to be like probability of you accepting it has to be like really large. Okay, for some very small epsilon. And the probability of you rejecting it has to again be like really large. So, I mean, actually for BPP, you just need like 2 by 3, 2 by 3, I think. But yeah, like you can always boost that in polynomial time. So we'll just take this as a definition. So like with very, very high probability, like you should be always convinced. Or like if the string is not in the language, if the graphs are actually isomorphic, then no matter which prover you're interacting with, like they can only cheat you with like extremely low probability, epsilon, like less than equal to epsilon. Okay. So like, I mean, the formal thing of epsilon is like epsilon of n, where n is the input length, and epsilon has to be a negligible function. Like, but yeah, like, I mean, for intuition's sake, like, you don't need to go into those details. Like, you can read up after, and we can discuss in detail later on. Okay. So basically, this is what we want. This is what an interactive proof system is of k rounds. And a general interactive proof system is like any interactive proof of any number of rounds. It's just like IP1 union IP2 up till infinity in natural numbers. Okay. So like if you have some interactive proof of some number of finite number of rounds, okay, then that you say that class has an interactive proof or it belongs to IP. So this problem we're looking at is called graph non-isomorphism is in IP. Okay. And so, and there's this famous proof, I think IP is equal to P space was either Shamir or Mikhail Goldwasser. Should not wrongly quote names, but yeah, like I'll look it up and say it later. Okay, so this famous proof that says IP is equal to P space, that was proved indeed by Adi Shamir. Okay, I think it's long back, right? 1990, I think. Yeah, Shamir 90. And this is like a really powerful thing. So basically, if you have an interactive proof, like the class is equivalent to being able to solve it with polynomial amount of space. I mean, and this like definitely has like a lot of implications, right? Like now you know that like even though you have like probabilistic time verifier and you're using only polynomial amount of time, which like automatically restricts you to P space, but you can't explore the entire space. Like all you need, like the only extra computational power that you're able to gain from this is okay, like being able to use like P space and like potentially just exponential time. And contrary to like popular opinion that exponential time is like so big, it's actually not that big when you look at the entire like space of all problems, with like some problems that cannot even be solved no matter how much time you give, right? So exponential time is like not that big, like yeah, depending on the lens you're looking at and like which field you're working in. So yeah, this is like a pretty breakthrough proof. I think this is the one that uses something called like a famous proof technique called arithmetization. Okay, I won't go into this, but yeah, if you're really interested, like you can read Arora Barak, complexity theory by like Sanjeev Arora and Boaz Barak. It's a textbook I've posted, and in that he in detail discusses this proof technique and like how to prove IP is equal to P space. Okay. So now, like I think I've spent like almost an hour, like not even getting to ZKP. So let's quickly get to ZKP. I hope it's not too long. Okay. So now we have interactive proofs. Another thing is, okay, like there's a verifier, there's a prover, and they are able to communicate. There's an input X, and finally the prover says like yes or no based on like whether it belongs, there's a language L, right? And the prover also knows what X is, obviously. Now the thing is, okay, like the prover wants to help the verifier, but not at its own cost. Okay, so you want to make sure that the prover can communicate with the verifier and it tells all the answers, but at the same time, make sure that the verifier does not get any more information out or does not learn anything about the prover's algorithm or like the prover's process, other than the fact that yeah, yes or no, this one bit of information is all it can like gain from the prover. Okay, so this is what we mean by zero knowledge. Like the prover wants to help the verifier, at the same time keep his secret algorithm, recipe, or computer, or whatever the prover has access to, some crazy like machinery that can like do this, secret. And from a practical standpoint, this makes sense. Like this setting makes sense when you want like to convince somebody that you know something without revealing what it is. Like you want to convince somebody that you solve the P versus NP problem, right? You say that I have a proof for P versus NP, and then somebody else will be like, no, I don't believe you. And then you go to them and you say, okay, yeah, here, say, take the proof. And like I found this very nice slides, which I think puts the exact thing in very good perspective. Let me pull it up. Yeah. Okay, I hope you can see it. Okay, I found the slides on the ITB website by a prof from University of Rochester. So yeah, so like somebody says I solved P versus NP, evil prof says how, the innocent like student gives the proof, the evil prof gives the proof to the Clay Institute and gets $1 million. Okay, and this is, I mean, I hope all of you can see like what the issue with this is. Like it's truly marvelous, but does not fit in this margin. Yeah, exactly. Like we want to basically say that, yeah, this proof is marvelous and does not fit in this margin. But at the same time, we don't want people saying, actually, you're just full of air, bullshit, whatever. Like I don't really believe you. So you want to make sure that the listener is convinced, at the same time does not have access to your technique. Okay, or access to like the computation like that you have. Right, so that secretly the verifier can't use the provers and like act like it can solve the problem in polynomial time, right? So this interaction happens in a total of polynomial time. The verifier should not be able to black box it out and freely say this. Like it always needs the prover to be able to do this, and without the prover it's helpless. It's not like once you interact with the prover you get something out and then you use that secret recipe to like forever solve the problem. And yeah, from a practical standpoint, that's what it means. From a theoretical standpoint, from the understanding of this thing, it means that you have access to infinite computational power, but you actually do not extract that access out. Like it's like, even though we're saying the prover has infinite power, we're also saying that like, okay, it has infinite power, but it's not that the verifier is actually getting full access to that infinite power. Okay, like whenever the verifier wants to do something, it's still bounded in its own methods. So just interactive access to like unlimited power does not give you unlimited power, is what we're trying to show, right? And that's what IP equals P space shows. Even though you have access to infinite power, you still are like stuck in like just polynomial space problems. There's so many problems outside it, and you still like aren't able to solve those because of your own computational limitations. Like the verifier's machine is still so slow and so bad that even though the prover is so powerful, the verifier just like is incapable of understanding the depth and glory of like the prover's like powers. And here the prover also is like scared of the verifier, so it wants to be safe, right? Okay, so how do we make this thing, like how does the prover go about this? So for this, a nice game, I hope like we can ensure more interaction. So there are like 2 tanks of water, okay, like or 2 beakers of water or whatever, like large beakers. This color. Okay, actually let's make it more interesting, which is like very applicable in my case. There's 1 beaker of water which is actually not blue, it's white, diffraction, whatever, but yeah, like give me artistic freedom. And there's 1 like bottle or like a beaker of Coke, and I am colorblind. Okay, so for me they both look black, and I want to like find out which is Coke and which is water, but I don't want to drink because I say I really hate like Coke. Okay. Hey, by the way, if you're uploading this to YouTube, make sure like you have the right copyright, so that because I've used the term Coke and stuff like that. So yeah, please make sure you do all that, otherwise it'll get taken down. Yeah, sorry for that. Okay. So yeah, like I want to like find out which is, I want to drink water. I'm really thirsty and I don't want to like make my throat worse. I have a cold, and yeah, so yeah, like what do I do? So I will, I'm sorry, but I will call upon my friend Arjun, who likes making fun of me that I'm colorblind always. And he will say like, okay, I actually know the difference. But the thing is, I obviously don't trust him, right? Because like he might cheat me. So I have to make sure that I come up with the right protocol that I can for sure know that whatever he's saying is true. Okay, that he doesn't like secretly give me Coke and make me drink it and make my life miserable. Right? I want to do that. At the same time, he also wants to make sure that he can have this fun every time. So he doesn't want me to figure out which is Coke and which is water. Okay, like, so he wants me to just be able to drink water this time, and then later when I leave, he just secretly like probably swap the container. So when I come back next time, I'm still confused. I still have to go through this arduous process, and in that, like, he will enjoy like seeing me struggle. So like, there's the verifier, that's me, and there's the prover, that's him, and we both like basically dislike each other and want us to go through pain. Okay, so we do this. So now what can I do? Like, can you come up with a nice protocol that I can do to like test this? So first, like, let's come up with just an interactive protocol. Forget the zero knowledge part. Like, can you come up with an interactive proof where I can ask questions and prover response back to me? Okay, so what I can do is like just interactive, forget zero knowledge for like the second. I can just pick up a small glass and I can take liquid from one of these two at random, right? And I can give it to the prover, ask the prover like, is it Coke or is it water? And the prover will tell me like, yeah, it is, like, yes, it's water, or like, no, it's not, right? And I can keep doing this enough number of times and we reach back the same thing before, right? Like, you just like, if they both were like indeed the same, like let's say both were Coke or something, then the prover will not be able to distinguish, right? And then like I will realize, okay, both these containers contain the same liquid and it doesn't seem safe enough for me to drink. But if the prover claims I can distinguish between these two, right, and I still am not able to by looking at them, I can use the prover and keep interacting, keep giving a random liquid each time and make sure that the prover gets the answer right every single time, because if the liquids are distinguishable. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And now how do I make, like, this is obviously not zero knowledge, because like at the end of like even one iteration, I will, like, if I know that the prover is like telling the truth, I'll figure out which container is what. But I hopefully don't want it, like, I mean, the prover doesn't want me to do that. So what you can do is, so okay, I can't remember the actual protocol. I don't know if there's a simplified protocol to do this.
You hide them and flip them and ask again. That
I don't understand. Who hides and flips? Can you repeat?
the verifier just hides the both of them and then flips them and asks again if which one is Coke. Like,
Yeah, the verifier can safely verify, but the prover has now in the process revealed information about which is Coke and which is not, right?
but that's like one bit of information, no?
Yeah, but that's the whole bit. Like, we don't want that extra bit also.
Okay.
I think
So yeah,
even I don't really remember this topic, but I think it's.
I mean, I know how to do it with RSA, but I don't know how to do
You
it.
just
like,
want to be
easily.
convinced that the prover can distinguish between them in this
Yeah.
particular thing. Yeah, so you'll be convinced, and the prover doesn't want to tell you how they distinguish, and they're not telling us. I mean,
Okay,
the prover
like-
just wants to prove that they're different, and there is some difference between them without telling you like what, I guess.
Oh yeah, okay. You don't have the algorithm
that.
to apply
But
this
yeah, I
on
never
any set of
understood
features.
what
Okay,
exactly
that's the
it was.
knowledge. Okay. So yeah, we're not getting any more, like, yeah, we're not extracting out the algorithm of the prover, right? I've not found the technique to like do this, maybe some chemical test or something. There's no way for the verifier, like after this interaction, if I give the verifier another input x2, then the verifier will again be confused without help of the prover, right? So basically, like, it is zero knowledge in the sense that the prover did not reveal any computation, any computational like advantage to the verifier that helps the verifier like solve the problem better when it tries again. Okay, so that basically means that like its technique is not revealed, and that's zero knowledge. Okay, So like it's slightly nicer, like when you see it formally and then you relate back. So when I say there's a ZKP, that means like for every string in the language, okay, there has to be a prover. And like same thing as IP, but the extra thing is, wait, not this. Yeah, so for every prover, okay, and like for every like every prover you have some interaction, right? So for every X you'll get some, let's say you have an interaction string, okay, this is the full transcript of interaction. This is identical to the verifier just running a simulation. Okay, so that is, the verifier can just simulate this entire like transcript without knowing. So yeah, this actually is not fully zero knowledge because the verifier can't simulate this transcript, right? The yes no transcript. Yeah, so I think we need to add more randomness on the prover side. Like I'll come to that. So verifier should be able to just simulate this conversation. So now, like basically, the verifier got the answer, but again, like it didn't get any useful information by looking at the transcript other than just like, yeah, yes or no, it verified. But it should be able to dream of this same interaction and get this. But obviously, like, why is the simulation not enough? Because simulation might be or might not be correct. Because like, like you might have a right or wrong prover. Like there has to exist at least one prover that helps you. But obviously, when you do the simulation, you don't know whether you have the right or wrong prover, right? So you can't still solve the problem efficiently just because you can simulate that. But yeah, the verifier is able to like simulate this entire like conversation in its mind without the prover's help. So basically, you did a lot of things which basically are like useless to the verifier, but it still found the answer to like what it was asking because it was interacting with the correct prover. Okay, and that is basically what zero knowledge is. Okay, let's. Yeah, there's another bunch of examples. Like, I mean, this is a popular one. I hope, like, does anybody know what this is?
Where's Waldo?
Yeah, exactly. So it's Where's Waldo? Like, it's this famous like children's book where like so many people, so much like randomness with very like blended colors, and you're supposed to find out where Waldo is, which I actually don't know in this case. But let's say somebody tells you they know, but they don't want you to be able to like solve the puzzle yourself. So what they can do is they can put a big like opaque sheet on top of this and make a small hole in it. Okay, and then place the hole, like the sheet is so large that you don't know how, like where the book is placed underneath, right? So if you go back, what the person can do is there's the book over here, right, which has the image, and they can place a huge sheet on top of it, and basically you cannot see where the book is underneath, like where it's placed, and the sheet has a small hole in it, and through that hole the person shows you where Waldo is. So now you know that, okay, this person knows where Waldo is. He was able to they were able to show me, but like later on when he gives you back the book, there's no way for you to again like figure out where that is, right? Because you only saw that small hole where you can only see Waldo and nothing in the neighborhood, like there's no extra information, right? So the prover was able to convince the verifier correctly. The verifier knows for sure that like if Waldo is in the page, the prover will be like, there'll be some prover with some big sheet of paper with a hole in it who's able to show. And if there is no Waldo, then no matter who comes to tell you, like there's no way they can show you Waldo from that, right? So we have an interactive proof, which is also zero knowledge, because once it's done, the proof verifier like only has that answer. It cannot solve the problem for any other input or resolve the problem for that input except by storing that answer for that like particular page or something. So it cannot like let's say the prover has some like very powerful technique of like pruning the space and quickly figuring out where Waldo is. No matter how complicated it is, you did not find that out because they just convinced you they know how to do it quickly. You can show them any page, they will be able to convince you like instantly that they can do it, but you are not able to extract any information about their like technique or algorithm, or be able to solve. Yeah, it can solve like 100 pages for you, and still on the 101st page, you're still on your own. You can't do anything like fast enough, right? If that makes sense. Okay, so I think like I've taken a lot of time. I'll try to quickly wrap this up. So yeah, if you're really interested in zero knowledge proofs, like yeah, please like you can read up from Aurora Barak, or yeah, you know, like if you find something, you can always ask on the complexity theory channel. We discuss. Like I'll try to wrap up with just a little more motivation and why this sort of system is useful. So where do we use ZKPs? Like, can somebody think of like some practical real world instance where we actually use zero knowledge proofs?
You can use it in cryptography to like
To?
public private key kind of thing that I have.
Can you? Okay.
Like I have a private key that can solve some secret, but I will not tell you that private key, and I have to prove that I have that private key.
But what do you mean by solve? What can the private key solve a secret for? Yeah, you're almost there. Like, I think you pick one example, you'll get the thing. So yeah, so the famous RSA crypto system, right? So what is it like? You have a secret key and a public key, right? And the public key, like, I mean, I'm going to simplify this protocol a lot, but the essence is still the same. The public key is a product of two primes P and Q, two very large primes, and we are working under the assumption that prime factorization, like factorizing a number, is really hard. Okay, so like, yeah, nobody can do it efficiently. Like, let's assume like for now that yeah, nobody can do it in polynomial time, nobody can do it like with a probabilistic machine in polynomial time. And the secret key is just P. Okay, so the prover has they all look like the same, has the secret key, and the public key is public information, and there's the verifier, right? So now, like, forget encryption and everything. Now, if you want to do like factorization, the verifier, like the prover, has access to the secret key. So verifier like looks at the public key, and it wants to, you know, like say, like check if the prover has this secret key or not, like whether the prover is like bluffing or not. So usually in RSA, like what happens is you have two functions. One is called encrypt, which takes the secret key. Okay, or encrypt is a function of the secret key, which takes an input X and produces like an encrypted output. And there's decrypt, which takes the public key and takes, you know, the encrypted value Y and produces X back. So the verifier can decrypt, but only the prover can encrypt, right? So now the verifier wants to know that the prover can really encrypt. So what can the verifier do? It can say send it a string X and ask it to give the encryption. Okay, keep zero knowledge aside for a second. We'll come back. Okay, and then the prover returns the encrypted value of X. How does the verifier like verify that Y is indeed the encrypted value of X? It decrypts it, checks if they match. Okay, so the verifier can keep doing this for a lot of inputs. Another thing is, by design, RSA, like there's a proof that even if you ask like a lot of encrypted, like you have a lot of like input and encrypted like X comma Y pairs in this case, that is X comma En C of X. Okay, let's say you have a set like this. Okay, for I from like you have like K strings. So like somebody like basically like you queried an encryption server and you have all these pairs, and then I give you a new string X, which is not in the existing strings. Then to still encrypt this X, Okay, that I messed up the order. Decrypt. I mean, I'll explain why I messed up the order also. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So basically, the verifier gives a string X and asks the prover to decrypt it. And because like every string can be decrypted, the prover will just decrypt and give it back. And now the verifier can check by encrypting it again and seeing if it gets back its input, right? So now I have a lot of pairs like this, right? Like let's say you query a server, like say Google server or something like that. You give it like, or like a password stored on a computer, right? Like basically the password is stored in like say like you decrypt like a bunch of passwords. Let's say you hack into a bunch of passwords and you have the decryptions, and I give you a new string. You still cannot decrypt it with high probability. So the probability that like you can compute decryption of X is still like less than epsilon. Okay, so even though you know the answers for a lot of strings, if I give you a different string, you still can't do it efficiently. Like you can't do it with like you can only solve it with like by guessing, literally, you know, like you just have to guess, okay, this is like probably this is the password, and you guess it. Fine. So, and this is like crucial to like our crypto systems, right? Like if you break, like you should not be able to, like, because let's say you store a lot of passwords on your computer and you know the like encrypted versions of the passwords that are stored, and you know the decrypted version of them, which is basically your input. With all those pairs, you still should not be able to break the crypto system itself. Otherwise, like somebody can store just like thousands of passwords on a computer, look at the input, and then just say, okay, now I can break any password stored on this computer using this like thing, which is actually what happens. Like that's why MD5 is not safe, because people found how to break the MD5 hash, and like a lot of different standardized hashes that were being used like decades ago, which are still in use like in certain like small use cases today, they can be broken. And like probably one of the strongest hashes is the SHA, the SHA-256 hash, which is probably the most common thing. If you look at your browser, open up the lock symbol in your URL, you can see that it's encrypted. You can verify it for that, etc., etc. And they use like some crypto system levels, which is not broken. Okay. And now you can see why zero knowledge is very important here. The prover should not reveal its secret, right? If the prover reveals the secret to the verifier after like interacting a few times, then you lose all the guarantees of crypto. And so this like zero knowledge proofs like essentially like form like the backbone of crypto. Like they're always hidden somewhere. And there's one more like, I mean, like the more like common like easy to understand use cases, something called digital signatures. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this. So what is a digital signature? Like, of course, it's not putting your sign on a PDF, even though that's digital because it's in a PDF, it's digitized, whatever. This is the worst form of signing anything. I mean, practically the way humans sign like checks and documents, like is probably one of the worst ways of like signing, mostly because 80% of humans have very easily forgeable signatures, and the rest 20, like, yeah, especially with digital, I just need, like, I don't need anything fancy. I just need this tool, right? So like I can move it, like I can, you know, I mean, okay, let's not dwell into the examples, but yeah, I could have written something here and something else, person signs here, move it here. And like access to a tool like rectangle select is like not like something crazy difficult, right? Like it's not like some crazy forgery thing. Anybody can do it. So yeah, that is not a good way to sign documents for sure. So let's come up with a smarter way of doing it. So how a digital signature works is, let's say there's a document, and with like every document is just a list of some text, right? Or like a sequence of bits. Even if it's a binary document, PDF document, you can think of it as a sequence of bits always. And the signer, okay, attaches his signature to this. Okay. And now the signature is not just like a function of the signer. It's not something that is always same. It's a function of the input also. Okay. So let's say the input is X. So a signature is going to be something sigma of X. It's a signature that's dependent on input. So different documents will have different signatures. So signer will have something called a signing key and a verifying key. There are two things, okay? The verifying key is then made public. Okay, so sigma, when you use the signing key to sign X, you will get a signature out, sigma, okay? So sign with this with the signing key, and you get a signature sigma. And how does like a person verify that it's indeed this person who did it? Like what they do is they use the verifying key, and they like call the verify thing with verify, and they pass the input X and the signature sigma, and yeah, they check if this is true. And also obviously we need the property that nobody can forge. That is, if for everybody who knows the signing key, they can always sign it correctly. But for anybody who does not know the signing key, the probability that like the signature you generate can be verified is very less. Okay, so if anybody does not know your signing key, the probability that they can forge your signature for that particular input is very less. Even if they have a lot of your previous documents with their signs, if they have a newer input, they cannot forge a newer like the signature for that. So even if they have like sign for x1, x2, x3 up till xk, for xk plus 1, without your secret key, they cannot forge it with like decent probability. Like epsilon here is like negligible probability. Okay, like once in a, I don't know, once in a long time. Blue moon seems, I don't know, like it's impossible. We need still probabilistic. Yeah, you know, like very, very rare. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. So how is this a zero knowledge proof? Like it's actually, this is not an interactive proof because there's no interaction, right? It's zero knowledge. The interaction is like limited to just like the verifying key being sent. So like we've removed the interaction part, but obviously you can also add interaction. And I think there is some famous protocol for, I'm not 100% sure, but there's a thing to de-interact zero knowledge proofs. So you can take an interactive zero knowledge proofs and make it non-interactive. I'm not sure if it works for all zero knowledge proofs, but yeah, there is some technique to do that. Okay, like it's similar to de-randomization of like random algorithms. I mean, obviously you can't de-randomize everything. In this case, I'm not 100% sure whether you can de-interactify everything. Okay, so digital signatures form a very like important class of zero knowledge proofs. Okay, not necessarily interactive, but just zero knowledge, because yeah, no matter run this like, and the verifier keeps doing this, they cannot extract your secret out, right? They do not know your signing key, and this is critical to the functioning of the internet. Like we make claims that like all these things are secure and whatever, and when you open up, I think I can do it. This is a file, yeah. So if I open up this, it says connection secure. I do this. It's verified by DigiCert. I do this, and yeah. So now, like basically using the like the web page is also signed by the source, okay, who has this like certification, and now the certification like helps you verify that like it's indeed this source that signed this and not somebody else who tried to force the signature. Okay, and I can actually view the certificate, and this is the certificate. Okay, like it's been like, I think, yeah, this is the public key of the certificate. Okay, and this is how it basically works. And this is like basically you're having, every time you reload a page or open, I mean, HTTPS, of course, not HTTP. Okay, you're using zero knowledge proofs in your daily life. So I believe like every day you have like at least thousands of zero knowledge proofs that you're relying on implicitly, like to be able to like have secure communication. Okay, so I think I'll stop with this. Oh, it's 9 o'clock. I think you can stop recording.